Midnight at the funeral home. The silent watcher. I have been a mortician for nearly 10 years, and until last month, I believed I'd seen the darkest facets of mortality. The hush of the funeral home always brought me a strange comfort, like I was tending to those who needed my final courtesy. But one evening, I noticed something off. I remember the time clearly, close to midnight. My work usually carried on into the late hours, and I relished the serenity. That evening, I completed the usual embalming procedures and closed the coffin on a man who had passed unexpectedly. A local teacher everyone seemed to love. A tragic heart attack, they said. I secured the coffin lid, double-checking all the bolts, then set about tidying my instruments. I didn't realize it at first, but there was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, like a charge in the air right before a lightning strike. The overhead fluorescent buzzed loudly, flickering for just an instant. Then I heard the faintest scraping sound, like fingertips brushing against wood. When I turned, the coffin I had just sealed appeared, disturbed. The lid was slightly askew, not flush as it had been moments before. My heart lurched. I convinced myself I'd simply been distracted. Perhaps I failed to lock the bolts correctly. Nerves can be tricky after a long, exhausting day, I told myself. Yet, a prickle of dread crept along my spine. Something in the funeral home silence wasn't as peaceful as before. Felt like the entire building was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. A nagging unease. I tried to brush off the incident from the previous night, reminding myself I was just overworked. But a knot of unease refused to unravel in my stomach. After a restless night, I returned to the funeral home early the next morning to prepare for a new arrival. It was a typical day in many ways: paperwork, phone calls from grieving families, the methodical tasks of arranging flowers and hearses. Yet, I couldn't erase the memory of that coffin's lid being out of place. Around dusk, after locking the front door to ensure no unwanted visitors, I headed into the embalming room. The overhead lights flickered again, making my shadow dance across the white-tiled floor. Over in the corner stood the coffin I had bolted shut the night before. Dread coiled in my chest, but I forced myself to approach it. It was sealed exactly as I left it earlier that morning. I carefully ran my palm over the lid, half expecting it to jolt beneath my touch. My hand trembled, but nothing moved. I exhaled and allowed myself a nervous grin. Perhaps my eyes had been playing tricks on me. I turned toward the new body, a frail old woman who had passed peacefully in her sleep, and began to prepare the tools. That's when the lights dimmed once more. A hiss of static from the ancient wall radio sent a chill through me. In that split second, I swore I saw the shape of a figure standing behind me in the reflection of the metal tray. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Only a fleeting shadow sliding out of sight. The unease was no longer just a dull ache in my mind. It was real, pulsing with each frantic beat of my heart. Something about the funeral home felt different, like the calm had grown teeth, ready to bite. Restless nightfall. I decided to sleep in my tiny office that night, thinking a change of scenery might help me confront my dread head-on. Perhaps if I stayed close, I could discover if there was a reasonable explanation. The funeral home was large, older than most in the region, and filled with an unsettling hush after dark. Its narrow halls seemed to grow longer with each step. I locked the main door, slid into the creaky cot in my office, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The building had its quirks. Pipes that rattled when the temperature changed, floors that settled with strange groans. But the more I listened, the more I realized that these sounds were different. They felt purposeful, like footsteps trying not to be heard. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a shallow sleep. I dreamt of open coffins, of pale hands reaching out to beckon me inside. In that haze, I heard a soft scraping again, that same noise from before. My eyes snapped open. It was pitch dark, the small lamp on my desk having gone out. My breath caught in my throat. I clutched my phone and turned on the flashlight. Its beams swept across the walls of my office, revealing nothing but dusty file cabinets. Yet the scraping persisted, and it was closer now, just beyond the doorway, perhaps in the corridor. Gathering what little courage I had, I crept toward the sound. At the threshold, I flicked on the hallway lights. The bulbs buzzed to life, illuminating shiny linoleum and rows of closed doors. The corridor was empty, but my spine tingled with the unmistakable feeling that I was not alone. I stood there, trembling, as a cold draft crept in from under a door at the far end. Evidence of the unseen. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had to investigate. I couldn't stand by and let my imagination tear me to pieces. Clutching a flashlight in one sweaty hand, I walked down the hallway, checking every door. Each was locked or otherwise unoccupied. The embalming room's door, however, was ajar. Inside, the old woman's body lay on a steel gurney, partially prepared for tomorrow's procedures. All seemed in place except for one unsettling detail. The coffin where I had placed the teacher's remains earlier that day was slightly open again. This time, there was no doubt someone or something had unsealed it. With trembling fingers, I aimed my flashlight at the coffin's interior. The teacher's body was still there, eyes closed, hands folded. But I noticed faint scratches on the inside of the lid, as though fingernails had scraped against the wood. That was new. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized these marks were fresh. Tiny splinters lined the edges of each scratch. I reached out to touch them. My fingers came away with a thin, red residue, blood or something too close to it. I lurched back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Impossible, I thought. He was embalmed. He shouldn't bleed. Fighting the impulse to run, I closed the coffin again, pushing down hard to fasten the locks. If anyone else saw this, would they believe me? Panic gripped my chest. I wasn't just dealing with an overactive mind now. I had evidence. But evidence of what? Ghosts? Something else? No part of my training prepared me for this nightmare scenario. And yet here I was, alone in a funeral home where the dead refused to rest. Whispers in the dark. I fled the embalming room and retreated to my office, slamming the door shut behind me as though it could keep the dead at bay. My breath came in short gasps, adrenaline roaring through my veins. I paced back and forth, trying to think rationally. Maybe I should call the police? But what could I say? That a corpse was scratching at its coffin. I was certain they'd chalk it up to delirium or some ghastly prank. Instead, I decided to check the funeral home security cameras. Over the years, I'd installed a few to prevent theft or unauthorized entry. I rarely reviewed the footage, but tonight, I hoped for answers. I powered up the old monitor and fast-forwarded through hours of silent corridors. Then something flickered on the screen, movement by the embalming room. There was a moment, around 2:13 a.m. The corridor light turned off, though I hadn't touched any switches. Seconds later, the camera feed showed a shadowy figure crossing the hall from right to left. My chest tightened, recognizing the silhouette. It looked like the teacher whose coffin kept opening. But that was impossible. Bodies don't just rise from the dead. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The camera feed flickered back to normal. No sign of forced entry, no one else moving about. I rewound it again and again, but each time I watched, my stomach twisted tighter. The shape's gait was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, like it was learning how to use its limbs. My hands shook as I paused the video. All I could do was stare at the shadowy outline. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't a mundane matter of faulty locks or my imagination. Something was stirring the dead, and it was only a matter of time before they paid me another visit. The confrontation with emptiness. Numb with dread, I realized I had to look inside that coffin again. I couldn't move forward without confirming what I'd seen on the security footage. Morning light was beginning to seep through the curtained windows, offering a tenuous sense of safety. Yet my heart pounded louder than ever, dreading what might await me. I returned to the embalming room, the floor squeaking underfoot. I forced my trembling hand to unlatch the coffin. The teacher's body was exactly where it should be, eyes closed, arms folded. No evidence that he'd gone wandering in the night, but those scratch marks still marred the inside of the lid. A cold wave of nausea hit me. It was too much. I ran to the sink and splashed cold water on my face, trying to steady my nerves. Why would the corpse appear on camera if it still lay here? The security footage couldn't lie. Could it? Then again, technology could malfunction, and maybe I was seeing a trick of the shadows. As I was drying my hands, I heard a faint creak behind me. I turned and nearly dropped my towel. The teacher's body was still, but his eyes were open now, both staring directly at me. A guttural scream caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, nearly crashing into a metal tray of instruments. My pulse hammered so loud I thought my head would burst. Then, just as quickly, his eyes slid shut again, leaving me questioning everything I just witnessed. Had he looked at me, or was I hallucinating from exhaustion? I approached the coffin cautiously, tapping a trembling finger against his cheek. No response. He was lifeless. I backed away, my mind spinning, and wondered, what if the dead truly refused to stay put? Searching for reason. In the days that followed, my mind became a battlefield between logic and the supernatural. I devoured every resource I could find: old medical journals, funeral home records, texts on embalming anomalies, even local legends. I spent hours in the funeral home's cramped archive room, rummaging through thick, dusty ledgers dating back a century. I discovered unsettling patterns in the funeral home's history. There were anecdotes about bodies that twitched after death, even some old notes regarding an inexplicable reanimation in the 1930s, quickly dismissed as rumor. The ledger entries were cryptic, referencing sightings of a restless shadow that roamed the corridors at night. But no official conclusion was ever drawn. As I dug deeper, certain remarks kept cropping up. A rumored curse, a lingering presence believed to be tied to the building itself. Some speculated it was the spirit of an old caretaker who had died under mysterious circumstances. Others said it was a residual energy from the unclaimed bodies that had been processed here for decades. None of this was definitive, yet each entry made my skin crawl. Every photograph I found seemed to capture silhouettes in the background, half-formed shapes that vanished upon closer inspection. It was as though the building had always harbored secrets in its shadows. Late one night, I sat alone in the archive room, a single lamp illuminating centuries of death records spread around me. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. My phone's battery was nearly dead, but it cast just enough light to show me the final lines of a faded letter. When the dead stir, the living must beware. Midnight is their hour, a breach in the night. That same night, I decided to keep watch once more. If the restless dead were truly roaming the halls, I needed proof beyond scratches and fleeting camera footage. I armed myself with a digital camera, a notepad, and the resolve to confront whatever roamed these corridors. Midnight arrived like a verdict. The building's silence took on a suffocating weight. I paced the embalming room, shining my flashlight across stainless steel tables and closed coffins. Hours ticked by without incident, and my mind began to wander. Perhaps the activity only happened sporadically. Maybe I'd spooked myself into believing fables. But near 3 in the morning, I heard it. A soft thump from inside one of the cold storage units. My heart seized. Slowly, I edged toward it. The unit held the old woman's body, the teachers having been moved to a separate viewing room for tomorrow's wake. The steel door was slightly ajar, a detail I knew I'd locked before, and from within that cramped compartment, I heard scratching. I lifted the door. My flashlight revealed the old woman's body, lying on the metal tray. She was turned on her side, head twisted at an impossible angle, eyes open wide in silent terror. Her bony fingers rested against the inside of the door, leaving faint, desperate markings. I lost my nerve. I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. As I tried to regain composure, I felt something cold graze the back of my neck. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly, but no one was there. A menacing chill swept the corridor, and that's when I realized. They were moving, and they were aware of me. Secrets in the basement. I had to know the source of this curse, if that's what it truly was. An old document hinted at a secret basement below the funeral home, sealed off years ago after a tragic incident no one wanted to discuss. I searched for any mention of it in the modern blueprints but found nothing. It was as though the entire lower level had been erased from official records. Still, I discovered a padlocked door near the furnace room. Rusted chains wrapped around it, and a sign reading, "Condemned," hung crookedly. My heart pounded. This had to be it, the place everyone wanted forgotten. After several hours of frustration, I managed to break the old lock with a crowbar. The door groaned open, releasing a stale gust that smelled of rotting wood and something fouler, decay trapped in the dark for years. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow flight of concrete steps descending into the earth. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The walls were lined with dusty shelves crammed with outdated medical equipment, cracked vials, and old chemistry sets. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a small room. The walls bore strange markings, symbols etched into the stone, their shapes tangled and hypnotic. In one corner, I discovered what looked like a makeshift altar, an old table with candle wax drippings and ancient photographs. My hand shook as I flipped through them. Images of corpses in various stages of embalming, their limbs contorted in unnatural ways. Then I noticed a scribbled note pinned to the table. They yearn for midnight's breath. Unrest guides them. Our sorrow binds them. The old journal. On the altar, beneath a stack of dusty papers, I found a leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded. With care, I opened it to reveal entries dated almost a century ago, each penned in a shaky hand. The author seemed to be a former caretaker of the funeral home, someone who'd uncovered a disturbing phenomenon. Scattered notes detailed how certain corpses, once brought to this place, showed signs of animation during the night. The caretaker wrote of his attempts to keep them contained, using salt lines and wards carved into the floors, methods gleaned from local folklore. His words grew more frantic with each entry, describing a persistent force awakening the dead at midnight. He speculated about a malevolent entity feeding off sorrow, urging the dead to roam. My heart pounded as I read. This caretaker had been fighting the same battle I found myself in now. Except he seemed to have known more about the funeral home's dark secrets. One particular line made me pause. If the living disturb them, they turn their lifeless eyes on any intruder. The final night, I fear, draws near. I closed the journal, the pages trembling in my grip. As if in answer, the faintest scraping echoed somewhere above me. The dead were stirring again, and with each passing entry, I realized I was following the caretaker's doomed path. If he hadn't found a way to stop it, how could I? Reckoning at the viewing room, I emerged from the hidden basement trembling, unsure of how much time had passed. My phone was dead, so I had no sense of the hour, but the darkness looming through the windows told me nightfall had already arrived. The funeral home's corridors were eerily quiet, as though waiting. The viewing room was set up for the teacher's wake the following morning. Rows of chairs faced a coffin on a raised platform, with floral arrangements lining the walls. Normally, this space would bring solace to grieving families. Tonight, it felt like a stage for a macabre performance. I found the coffin's lid wide open. The teacher's body lay inside, his waxen face lit by the soft glow of the overhead lights. My pulse thundered as I approached, unable to ignore the sense of dread creeping up my spine. Had he moved again? Then I noticed it. His hands weren't folded across his chest anymore. Instead, his arms rested at his sides, fingers curling slightly, as if attempting to grip the coffin lining. A shudder rocked me. I glanced around, half expecting him to sit upright at any moment. Despite my terror, I needed to see if there were new scratches or markings. I leaned over the coffin and examined the lid. Sure enough, more gouges marred the wood, freshly cut, splintered edges. My breath caught in my throat. He was trying to get out, or perhaps he had gotten out already and returned. A noise from behind me made me spin around. A floral wreath had toppled off its stand, landing with a soft thud. The air felt charged, and a sense of unseen eyes watching me made my blood run cold. I stood there, with nowhere to run, no idea how to stop what was happening. And in the silence, the stench of old lilies and decay clung to my nostrils, intensifying my terror. A desperate ally. I retreated to my office, heart pounding in my ears, determined to find any way to end this ordeal. Before my phone had died, I had sent a frantic text to an old friend, a medical examiner named Evelyn, someone who dealt with death on a daily basis. I'd hoped she might have some rational explanation or at least offer comfort. Now, with my phone off, I could only wait. To my surprise, an hour later, the funeral home's doorbell rang. In that ominous stillness, the sound was jarring. Clutching my crowbar in one hand, I cautiously opened the door to find Evelyn, winded and eyes wide. She took one look at my pale face and demanded an explanation. I ushered her inside, locking the door behind us, and led her through the halls. She was skeptical at first. Who wouldn't be? But as I showed her the scratches on the coffin and played the camera footage of the shadowy figure, her expression shifted from doubt to alarm. "They're moving? That's anatomically impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Rigor mortis eventually passes, but it doesn't cause people to walk around." I told her about the caretaker's journal and the references to a malevolent force. Despite her scientific background, Evelyn didn't dismiss the possibility of something beyond explanation. "We need to document everything," she urged, her voice quivering. "If this is real, we'll need proof." She gathered her forensics kit from her car. Together, we began to search for more physical evidence. Blood smears, footprints, anything. But as we moved from room to room, I felt the unshakable sense we were being stalked by multiple sets of eyes. Marks of the dead. While Evelyn snapped photographs of the coffins and the scratch marks, I guided her to the cold storage area where I'd found the old woman's body contorted. To our horror, the steel door hung open again. Inside, the tray was empty. The old woman's body was gone. We shared a terrified glance, both of us inching away from the open storage unit. That's when I spotted a trail of dark smears on the floor. Little footprints, almost childlike in size, but the shape was off. It was as though the skin had shrunk and twisted, leaving bony impressions. "These footprints shouldn't exist," Evelyn muttered, her voice barely audible. She knelt and took a swab of the residue, but her trembling hands revealed her fear. We followed the footprints into a narrow corridor leading to a storage closet. The door was ajar, and the overhead light flickered ominously. Together, we steeled ourselves and pushed it open. Inside, the old woman's corpse stood slumped against the wall, her limbs arranged in a grotesque parody of a living stance. Her eyes were wide open, and her jaw hung slack, as though she had been screaming silently for ages. My stomach lurched, and Evelyn stifled a cry. Evidence or not, this sight shattered whatever composure we had left. Evelyn raised her camera, but her fingers shook so violently that the flash stuttered. The old woman's body toppled forward, landing at our feet with a wet thud. My vision blurred with panic as I realized our worst fears. The dead weren't just twitching or scratching. They were leaving their resting places entirely. Encounter in the corridor. Our immediate instinct was to run. We bolted from the closet, the corridor seeming to close in around us like a living entity. Evelyn clutched my arm, her breath ragged. Neither of us had any illusions about the safety of this place anymore. As we turned a corner, we nearly collided with another figure. My heart lurched at the sight of the teacher's corpse standing upright in the hallway, leaning against the wall as if awaiting our arrival. His head was canted to one side, eyes dull but unmistakably open. A low gasp escaped my lips as we backed away. He took a step toward us, slow, shuffling, a mockery of life. I remember the look in Evelyn's eyes, pure terror. Her rational mind wanted to dismiss the possibility, yet the proof stood right before us, defying every law of nature. We retreated, but the teacher moved with a bizarre determination, each step accompanied by a faint creak of stiff joints. We dashed into an adjoining corridor, my frantic mind scrambling to think of a plan. Should we barricade ourselves somewhere or try to flee the building entirely? As I slammed the door to the embalming room behind us, we heard a low, dragging sound from the hallway, confirming he was still there. Perhaps others were, too. My hands shook too violently to hold the crowbar properly. Evelyn grabbed a heavy metal stand, her eyes darting around, searching for any exit that might be safe. It was in that moment, cornered, terrified, certain we were in mortal danger, that I felt a flicker of grim understanding. The funeral home wasn't just haunted. The bodies themselves wanted something. They were drawn to us, to our living presence. And with each passing night, the pull grew stronger. Trapped with the dead, Evelyn and I barricaded ourselves inside the embalming room, stacking metal trays and heavy equipment against the door. My mind raced, remembering the caretaker's journal. He wrote about something that stirs at midnight, turning the dead into restless puppets. The question haunted me: why? We tried to formulate a plan. Calling the police would only lead to more chaos if they arrived to find walking corpses. Besides, we had no phone signal in the basement, and my cell phone was drained. Evelyn's phone was out in her car. We were effectively alone, trapped. Thud, thud, thud. The door shook, sending vibrations through the metal trays. My throat tightened as I heard the faint scraping of nails against wood. They were trying to get in. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes glassy with terror. "Is there another exit?" she whispered. "There's the basement door," I replied, voice trembling. "We might be able to get out through a back loading dock. But that place it's not safe." She gave me a sad, determined nod. Anywhere was better than here. We gathered ourselves, unblocking the back door that led toward the furnace area. Each bang on the barricade made my skin crawl. I feared that the next blow would force the door open and let the cadavers spill in. With all the strength we had left, we slipped out into the corridor, every step a gamble. The lights flickered overhead, casting ghoulish shadows that seemed to move on their own. The stench of decay assaulted us, and I could swear I heard whispers in the walls, beckoning us to join them. Descent into darkness. Guided by a single flashlight, we hurried down the winding stairs into the condemned basement. My memory of its layout was fuzzy at best, overshadowed by the terror of my previous exploration. Evelyn stayed close, scanning for any movement. We passed the shelves of dusty medical equipment, the caretaker's cryptic altar, and the wall of strange markings. Everything felt more sinister now, as if the entire space pulsed with malevolence. I led Evelyn through a narrow corridor that branched off from the main chamber, towards a rusted metal door I hoped led to the old loading dock. A wave of fetid air greeted us, forcing us to stifle gags. We pressed on, stepping carefully over crumbling floor tiles. Suddenly, from behind, we heard a hollow groan. Our flashlights wavered as we spun around, spotting a silhouette in the dim glow. It stood at the base of the stairs, its posture hunched, arms hanging limply at its sides. It was the old woman's corpse again, head lolling unnaturally. She took a staggering step forward. Evelyn inhaled sharply. We ran for the door, adrenaline surging. The old woman's footsteps followed, each step an agonizing scrape on the concrete. Reaching the door, we pulled with all our might. It resisted, rusted shut by decades of neglect. Panicking, I slammed my shoulder against it. Evelyn joined in, her breath ragged. Behind us, the old woman let out a rattling exhale, edging closer. Finally, with a shriek of metal, the door gave way. A swirling wind of stale, cold air rushed in. But before we could slip through, bony fingers curled around the doorframe, inches from my face. The living and the dead. I lashed out with the crowbar, connecting with the corpse's withered arm. There was a sickening crunch as old bones snapped. But the old woman didn't react like a living being would. She didn't cry out or recoil. She merely staggered backward, letting out a low hiss of escaping gas from her parted lips. We pushed through the doorway and found ourselves in a small, cluttered space that smelled of gasoline and mildew. It was the old loading dock, filled with rotted wooden pallets and dusty tarps. The large bay door loomed ahead, promising escape. Perhaps if we could force it open, we'd reach the outside world. Evelyn scrambled to find a lever or latch. The dead woman lurched into the room, dragging her broken arm. I gritted my teeth, swinging the crowbar again. A blow to her collarbone tore flesh, but she kept advancing. Time felt stretched and disjointed, every second a minor eternity. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw more movement. Another figure had squeezed into the corridor behind her. A tall, gaunt shape. The teacher. His eyes were open, fixed on us as if guided by some unseen puppeteer. Evelyn finally found the latch and yanked. The rusted mechanism groaned. Light from a solitary street lamp seeped into the gloom as the dock door rose inch by inch. For a moment, hope surged within me. Freedom was so close, but the dead were closer. Their pale, stiff fingers reached out, threatening to pull us back into the shadows. Unwelcome dawn. We burst out into the open air just as the first glimmer of dawn colored the horizon. My lungs filled with crisp morning air, yet my senses were still in turmoil, expecting a corpse to grab me from behind. Evelyn and I staggered onto the asphalt, hearts pounding, collapsing against a cracked concrete wall. Behind us, the funeral home stood silent and watchful, an ominous monument to the horrors within. We half expected the dead to surge after us, but nothing stirred. The teacher's body remained at the threshold, as though the building itself bound him to its haunted confines. Evelyn fumbled for her car keys, her entire body shaking. "We need help," she muttered, tears filling her eyes. For a moment, I wondered if it would matter. Who would believe us? Even if the authorities arrived, would they be able to stop what was happening inside? Still, we had to try. We made our way to the front of the funeral home, where her car was parked. The sun's rays cast twisted shadows across the windows. Through the glass, I thought I saw movement, the faint shape of someone or something crossing the hallway. A chill ran through me. As we climbed into the car, my mind whirled. Part of me wanted to race away and never return, to leave that cursed place to rot. But another part knew we couldn't just abandon it. If the caretaker's journal was right, the phenomenon might worsen, and more bodies could be brought in. More families could suffer unimaginable horrors. We drove away, silent except for our ragged breathing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dead teacher's vacant gaze. My hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled desperation, uncertain if we'd find any solution before midnight came again. A final return. Later that day, we contacted a small group of people we trusted. Some from medical backgrounds, others from local law enforcement, though we kept our explanations vague. We returned to the funeral home armed with more flashlights, crowbars, and a generator to keep the lights from failing. The others were uneasy but followed our lead. We showed them the old caretaker's journal, the scratches on the coffins, and the security footage. It was enough to convince them that something truly wrong had nested here. That evening, as dusk settled in, we prepared for the worst. We spread salt across thresholds, mimicking the caretaker's attempts to contain whatever malevolent force lurked within. We repeated the words we'd found in old texts, chanting half-remembered phrases in the echoing corridors. A sense of futility weighed on my heart, but we pressed on. Midnight arrived, and so did the horrors. Lights flickered, shadows danced. Doors creaked open on their own. Somewhere, a pane of glass shattered. Our small team stuck together, searching the halls for the newly restless dead. We found them in the viewing room, the teacher, the old woman, and two others who had died that week. They stood upright, swaying gently in the darkness, hands twitching at their sides. A policeman aimed his flashlight at their faces. They stared blankly, but an undercurrent of malice seemed to emanate from their lifeless forms. No one spoke. We all knew the next moment could be our last if they decided to attack. All the while, I felt an inexplicable pull toward the sealed basement. The symbols, the altar, the caretaker's cryptic warnings. It was all tied to that hidden chamber. I sensed the funeral home itself was a conduit for a force we barely understood. Echoes of midnight, determination guiding me. I slipped away from the group and descended one final time into the basement's shadows. I carried the caretaker's journal, flipping to his last entries. He had described a ritual to banish the force animating the dead, involving the destruction of its focal point, the altar. But he never succeeded. He vanished before concluding his account. I found the altar as before, thick with dust and old candles. The caretaker's scratchy handwriting provided a litany of words. My voice trembled as I read them aloud, the echo bouncing off stone walls. The air prickled, a static charge building all around me. Then I struck the old table with a sledgehammer. Once, twice, 3 times, would splintered, sending shards everywhere. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer. I felt a tremendous weight lifting, as if the funeral home itself took a long, tortured breath. Upstairs, the dead shrieked in unison, an unearthly wail that made my blood run cold. The floor quaked, dust raining down from the ceiling. I stumbled, nearly falling, but forced myself to keep swinging until the altar was reduced to rubble. Finally, silence descended. My ears rang with the memory of their cries, and my chest burned from exertion. I raced upstairs, heart pounding. In the viewing room, the undead forms lay collapsed on the floor, truly motionless this time. Their eyes were closed, hands limp, no longer pulled by the funeral home's cursed grip. Evelyn and the others were shaken, but alive. As dawn broke, we carefully returned the bodies to their coffins, ensuring they would finally rest. We all parted ways, agreeing to keep the horrifying details to ourselves. No one would believe it anyway, and some truths are too dark to share. To this day, I still work as a mortician, though I rarely stay past sundown. Sometimes, late at night, I recall that final midnight at the funeral home. Even with the altar destroyed, I can't shake the feeling that something lingered, some echo that refused to fade. Whenever a new corpse arrives, I find myself double-checking the locks, peering into unlit corners. Because deep down, I know, once the dead have tasted motion, they might again rise at midnight and turn their gaze upon the living.